Chapter 3 Fathers and Sons. February 27, 2010. Ohio is not beautiful in late February. Ohio is gray in late February. Thomas had put off the trip for one more week before the pressure from his mother had become too much. She scheduled a time for him to meet with Professor Crane at 1 o'clock on the following Saturday. This meant he'd had to leave just after 8 from his mother's house in Monroe. He had to stop there on his way out to pick up a gift Rebecca had insisted he take to Mr. Crane, of course. The trip was uneventful. 75 to 23, 270 around Columbus, 33 all the way home. He'd made the trip multiple times as a kid. His parents loved Hocking Hill. Get there, keep going southwest, you hit Athens. While the majority of the trip was familiar, the final stretch was not. Despite Thomas trying desperately to get his mother to schedule a meeting at the college or literally anywhere in public, she had insisted that Bert had insisted that it just had to be done at his home. This was more awkward in some ways to Thomas, but did create for less city driving, which he considered a positive. Less city driving didn't do the final portion of the trip justice. If the city was flat, urban, and straight, where Bert lived was hilly, country, and curvy. Traveling southwest across Ohio is strange in that it's flat for a long time, and then it's really not. Thomas had expected a man who taught at university for 40+ years to live in a small city suburb. Bert had gone a different direction. He didn't live in the backwoods. He lived in the woods behind the woods beyond the backwoods. Fortunately, the GPS held up. Thomas had worried it wouldn't, and he'd be roaming endlessly around the hills searching for Bert and killing his brakes. But at the 3-hour and 44-minute mark, a British woman informed him he had reached his destination, or at least the start of it. The driveway was long. So long, in fact, that Thomas started to wonder if he was just on another dirt road and the GPS had it wrong. But a house did finally appear, and it was not what he expected. It was old. 2 stories, boxy, wraparound porch on the lower level, propane tank to the side. It reminded him of the country farmhouses he'd grown up around in Michigan, but with the thickness of the woods and the roll of the hills, it was certain no one could farm here. It would be hard to walk off the beaten path here, much less use the land for anything meaningful. But the house was something. Despite only being 2 floors, it seemed to tower. It rose in such a way that as he got closer, it looked completely out of place for the wooded setting. Thomas was sure there was a bizarre story behind its construction, but he'd hoped to be gone before he learned it. He chose a random location in the driveway and called it a parking space. He checked his cell phone as he exited the car. No signal. There were no other vehicles in sight, but there was an old metal pole barn off the side of the driveway, nothing more than grass connecting the two. He hoped a car was in there and he hadn't wasted a trip. It was a short trek to the porch. Thomas was glad that a midweek warm-up had melted the snow from last week's storm. He passed a few piles of dirty residual snow, evidence that someone had actually plowed the driveway at some point. Otherwise, the landscape was dull, brown on the ground, gray in the sky, no leaves on the trees, just like home. He reached the porch, approached the front door, saw no doorbell, and knocked 3 times. The door instantly opened, almost before his hand had left it. A man who was far too young to be Professor Bert Crane stood in the open doorway. He was thin, perfectly bald, with a large, unkempt beard and large black-framed glasses. He looked hesitant. Hi, Thomas began a little too loudly. I'm here to see Professor Crane. He's not here. The man cut him off. He won't be back for some time. You'll have to try again. The man began to close the door. Rudely, Thomas thought. Thomas placed his hand gently on the door. I'm Thomas Redmond. Professor Crane knew I was coming. The man shifted his head back and forth, bird-like. You're Thomas Redmond? He asked, suddenly interested. Son of Edward? I thought you were coming Sunday. Well, yes, Edward was my father. I was supposed to meet with the professor today, I thought. He had some things for me. The man opened the door fully again, motioning abruptly for Thomas to enter. Thomas stepped into the house hesitantly. The house looked as old inside as it did outside. He saw a stairway leading upward to his left, a hallway leading deeper into the house in front of him, and a small living room to his right. Come in, come in. Events have somewhat gone astray. Have a seat on the couch here. I'll be right back. I have to get something. The man's movements were jittery. Without stopping his movement, he pointed to the couch and began walking away from Thomas down the hall. Hey, can I ask, who you are? Thomas said bluntly. The man didn't stop walking and yelled over his shoulder, I'm Brett. I'm Bert's son. Sorry, give me a minute. He disappeared around the corner. Thomas moved slowly toward the couch, peering around the room as he did. The room looked like it hadn't been used since Carter was president. A musty aroma lingered in the air, and the carpet and couches were 70s relics, maybe earlier. After a moment, Brett returned. He was carrying an old briefcase and slammed it down on the coffee table in front of Thomas. He then sat in an equally old-looking armchair across from Thomas. Hey, look, I can come back, Thomas said as Brett opened the briefcase and began shuffling through what looked like 1,000 sheets of paper ordered with no rhyme or reason. If you weren't expecting me. No, Brett cried out. No, you can't. That's part of the problem. That's why he had to leave. I have to show you this. It's crucial. Where is it? Here. No. Yes. Here. He pulled a larger sheet of paper from the briefcase. It was light blue and looked like architectural drawings or a schematic of some sort. He tossed the briefcase aside and started to unfold the paper onto the coffee table. Thomas leaned forward but couldn't make anything out on the paper due to Brett's hands waving around as he spread the sheet. There, Brett said. Look, do you know what this is? At first, Thomas didn't, mainly because he still hadn't gotten a good look at it, but also because it appeared to be facing Brett. As if keyed to his thoughts, Brett realized it. Ah, he quickly turned the document to face Thomas. Now look. For a split second, the image in front of him didn't register. Then suddenly it did, and the disposition of Thomas Redmond immediately changed. Where did you get this? He asked slowly, trying to curtail the anger in his word. Wait, Brett replied, placing two hands up defensively. I did that wrong. I should have explained. Don't get upset. This is your work, I know. What lay in front of Thomas Redmond was indeed his life's work. Life's work was maybe an overstatement, as he was only 24 years old, but it was certainly what he intended to make his life's work. To a layperson, it looked like schematics for a small metallic tube, almost like a thick pen with an opening for a laser pointer on the end. But unlike any other person in the world, or so he thought, Thomas knew the diagram to represent the scientific breakthrough he'd hoped would one day revolutionize energy production on planet Earth. Where did you get this? He asked again, more serious this time. Look, I know what you're thinking. It's not that. When I said this isn't your work, I wasn't lying. I don't know how else to explain it. Look closely. It is your work, or it will be, but you haven't done it yet. At least, not all of it. He let out a frustrated hiss. How can I word it? I have this because you gave it to my father, and he left it for me to give it to you. Thomas stood up and began to walk slowly around the coffee table, totally ignoring the man's impossible explanation. I don't know who you are, and I don't know how you got this, but I know I've never met you, and I know I've never met your father. I want everything you have of mine and my family's right now. Brett stood up and started to back away slowly. Thomas, please. I know this is difficult to follow, but I need you to listen. My father wanted to be here, but he had to leave. He left 3 days ago. He told me you were coming, and he told me to show you this. But you have to look at the schematic. Thomas stopped and shook his head, breathing heavily. Where's your father? He asked as calmly as he could. He's in Petersburg. Of all that had happened so far, this was the most shocking development to Thomas by some magnitude. Petersburg, Michigan? Thomas asked, eyes widening in disbelief. Brett let out a nervous laugh. Is there another? He said with an uncomfortable smile. Thomas walked back to the couch and sat down. A brief moment passed as he looked around the room, scatterbrained. Why the hell would your father have to miss this meeting to go to Petersburg? Because, Brett said as he pointed to the document on the table, that's where this ultimately needs to go. For God's sake, Thomas, will you please look at the schematic?